So, hello everyone. My name is Mark Cutler and I'm a professor of physical geography. And I've had the real fortune over the years to work in a science called Earth observation and to apply that to many different kinds of environments, from coral reefs to lakes, from Scottish peat bogs through to peat swamp forests. And when I was reflecting on the research that I've done over the years, I thought it would be nice to wrap up some research that I started just as I came out of my PhD. And also we've carried on over time. And it represents work that I've just also published now. So it's a full 20 or so year program of research. And the research revolves around tropical forests and how we can monitor and map them and understand some of the changes that are going on in these really fragile ecosystems around the world. Now, the video that you can see has been captured by Dr. Sol Milne from Aberdeen University, and it represents footage from a drone. And what you can see on the left-hand side is you can see an area of forest that's been logged. On the right-hand side is an area of pristine forest. That forest is very diverse, it's full of carbon, and it's full of the ecosystem services that we get from these wonderful tropical forests. On the left-hand side, the area that's being logged, note that the area is not clear felled. We don't lose all of the trees in this process of logging. Some trees remain. And that leaves us with critical questions. Questions like, well, how do these forests recover? How do they come back to life? Do they regrow in the same way? Does the biodiversity come back in the same way as it did before the area was logged? And then how resilient are these forests to short-term climate shocks like drought and wind events and things like that? So in order to try and answer some of these questions, we started a program of work, as I say, about 20 years ago in a state called Sabah, which is part of Malaysian Borneo. And at that time, we established a number of plots in the forest, and we went and measured the trees. We measured the species, the diameter of the trees, the heights of trees, all these sorts of things. And that tells us about the biodiversity, it tells us about the carbon that's locked up in the forest, and it tells us about essentially how healthy the forest is. Now, some of the plots were in areas that were logged, and some of the plots were in a conservation area where the forest has never been logged. And so that was 20 years ago, and we published a number of papers and we did a lot of work around understanding the impact, the short-term impact of logging. But now we've been back after 20 years. One of the advantages of being in the business for so long is that we can look back over time and see how things have changed. And so in 2015, we got some more money to go back to have a look at some of these plots. And just at that time, there was a drought as well. So that allowed us to look at these short-term shocks to the system, as well as the long-term recovery of the forest post-logging. And we've also, at the same time, as well as being there in the field, we've also made use of this science called Earth observation, collecting data from satellites, from aircraft, from drones, and even from instruments in the hand. The bottom photograph here is of one of our research assistants, Matthias, who's measuring the reflectance of light from leaves, and from that we can tell lots of things about the biochemistry of the leaf. So measuring the whole trees down to individual leaves, from satellites, from drones, but also in the field. So what have we found during this 20-year program of research? Well, if we have a look first of all at this short-term climate shock, the drought that occurred a few years ago, this is due partly to the El Niño Southern Oscillation, which leads to drought within this part of the world. And we noticed a number of things were going on. First of all, we looked to see whether trees were dying as a result of the drought, and we used high spatial resolution satellite imagery and looked for areas where trees were dying, but we didn't see that. So it suggested that the forests were fairly resilient to drought. We also then looked at the things that were growing in the forest and things were doing well against those things that were not doing so well. And we found that lianas are those vines that Tarzan swings on, and they're parasitic plants that infest the crown of trees. And they do really well in dry conditions. And we found that during the drought, actually they were changing the composition of the forest. They were becoming more prevalent, as you can see in the image on the bottom right-hand side. But we also noticed something that the trees were doing. The trees themselves were adapting to the changing conditions. And by measuring the reflectance of light and by measuring the leaves, we noticed an increase in pigments within the leaves. The trees seemed to be loving the fact there was more light available and less cloud. But were they really photosynthesizing more? The honest answer is we don't yet know, and we've still got more work to do. But what was clear was the value of Earth observation in monitoring the forests and understanding some of the dynamics. Now, the next part of the work is about long-term resilience and long-term recovery of the forest. So remember I said we measured trees back in the mid-90s. We went back from 2016 onwards and we measured those same forest plots. And in total, we looked at about 257 forest plots, both from our work and from others. And what we found is we looked at the recovery of the trees in terms of the carbon, the biomass that's there. On the very right-hand side of this slide, you can see measurements taken from unlogged forest, from pristine forest. So that's the sort of the baseline carbon, if you like, that's within the forest. On the left-hand side, you've got measurements from plots where the forest has just been left to regenerate naturally. And in the middle, you've got measurements from plots where active restoration has gone on. So what's happened here is that people have gone in and weeded between the trees or enrichment planting, so planting seedlings, cutting vines and lianas and things like that. And what's clear is that the recovery of the forest, when we use active restoration methods, is much quicker and faster than if we just let the forest to regenerate naturally. So we disturb the forest through logging, but through our intervention, we can also then apply active restoration methods to try and help the forest recover. And we also looked at this not just in our forest plots, but over space as well. So the map on the left is derived from a laser scanning instrument called a LiDAR. And in the left-hand side, you can see an area of conservation area, so not forest that's never been logged. And in the plot on the right-hand side, the right hand, what we call violin plot, it's essentially the distribution of data in those different areas. So what we see is a really high amount of carbon in the pristine forest. In the forest that's been left to regenerate naturally, much lower levels of carbon. And in the middle, the areas of active restoration. And you can see much higher levels of carbon in the areas of active restoration. And we estimate that this has the impact of advancing the recovery of the forest by about 20 years, so that eventually the forest will, from a carbon point of view, get back to those areas of pristine forest. But there's also a question around, is this economically viable? Because active restoration costs a lot of money. And many companies around the world are buying up bits of forest for investment purposes and things like this to get the carbon credits. So is it worth their while actively investing in active restoration? So what we did is we modelled the carbon break-even point. So we took how much it costs to restore a forest. We looked at how much money you would get from carbon credits, which tend to be issued every 5 years, and discounted for the value of money over time over a 30-year project. And what's clear is at this moment in time, the carbon price is not enough to offset the value of active restoration. And that actually what we need is we need a carbon price much higher in the region of between $50 to $80 of carbon dioxide, tons per carbon dioxide. And the reason that value actually is one that the Paris Agreement has suggested is required to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. So we are also arguing for a much higher carbon price so that investors will actively look at active restoration measures within tropical forests. The other thing that this work shows, though, is this shows that those forests that have been actively logged and regrow are immensely valuable in terms of their biodiversity, their resilience, and also the carbon that's within them. And it's these forests that we should be protecting, not just those areas that have not been disturbed, but those areas that have been previously disturbed and grow back. And so there are, like all good science, there's a number of questions that still remain, particularly around timescales of measurement and things like that, but also about whether what's the best way of restoring and managing these systems. But again, it really shows the value of the current state of tropical forests, and that rather than chopping them down and saying we're going to plant more forest elsewhere to compensate, actually what we need to do is to manage and conserve the existing forest stock that we've got, even those that are highly degraded. And then the other thing that all of this work has shown is the value of Earth observation. All of these different methods, from satellite imagery to laser scanning to measurements on the ground. And occasionally, really interesting things pop up, like the image you can see on the right-hand side. This is a laser scan of the world's tallest tropical tree. And it came out of this work. We were just looking through the data, and up popped a really tall tree. We measured it. It was over 100 meters. We had to send someone up it to verify that, but it's now the tallest ever recorded tropical tree. I just want to finish by saying some thanks, and these thanks are really important because all of this work is done in collaboration with the Southeast Asian Rainforest Research Partnership. And the research assistants who live and work in the forest, it's an absolute privilege to see them in action and to be just a very small part of a much larger programme of work trying to understand tropical forests and in particular to try and conserve these really fragile ecosystems. Thanks very much.